Hi, I'm Patty Satalia, a retired producer host with WPSU TV and FM at Penn State Public Broadcasting. The Heritage Foundation would like you to know about its so-called Promise for America. I'd like every American voter to know about it too, just not for the same reasons. In the next 45 minutes, I'm going to give you a broad overview, a sort of primer on the published plans for a second Trump administration. They're saying the quiet part out loud. It's called Project 2025. What is it? Who's behind it? And what's at stake? Let me start by telling you a bit about the Heritage Foundation. Founded in 1973 to publish conservative, business-friendly policies, the 50-year-old Heritage Foundation is one of the most powerful and influential right-wing think tanks in Washington, D.C. The foundation has helped staff and set the agenda for every Republican administration since Ronald Reagan. Reagan called the foundation, quote, a vital force in the many successes of his presidency. By the end of Reagan's first year in office, he had implemented more than half of the 2,000 policy proposals drafted by Heritage. Now, let's fast forward. In 2015, Heritage leadership mocked Donald Trump's candidacy, questioned his conservative credentials, and called him a clown. But candidate Trump pledged to consult Heritage on potential Supreme Court nominees, and when he won the White House in 2016, he delivered, nominating Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. According to author Michael Lewis, the Trump campaign, not expecting to win, hadn't even bothered to prepare an acceptance speech, let alone an action plan for taking over the reins of the federal government. Governor Chris Christie, you'll remember, prepared transition binders that a senior Trump aide tossed into the garbage. By all accounts, Trump's presidential transition was a hot mess. Heritage swooped in, playing an outsized role in staffing Trump's administration. Some referred to it as a shadow transition team. According to CNN, no other Washington institution has that kind of footprint in the transition. In Trump's first year in office, he implemented nearly 64% of their policy recommendations, the most of any president since the organization's founding. And Trump's crowning achievement, the 2017 tax cuts, that was a policy crafted by Heritage. The University of Pennsylvania, which produces an annual index of global think tanks, rated Heritage the top think tank in the world in terms of impact on public policy, 3 years running, in 2018, 2019, and 2020. So what impact will the Heritage Foundation have this time around? That remains to be seen. But one thing is abundantly clear. This is not your father's Heritage Foundation. Kevin Roberts became president of the Heritage Foundation in October 2021. Since taking the reins of the half-century-old institution, he has adopted far more populist positions in step with the evolution of the Republican Party itself under Donald Trump. One striking shift is in the foreign policy arena. The once hawkish Heritage Foundation surprised many when it opposed U.S. aid to Ukraine. It has also changed its tune on the free market, states' rights, and in countless other ways, some say to remain relevant with the, quote, new right. So what is Project 2025? Well, it's the Foundation's newest policy handbook, some say policy Bible. Published in April of 2023, earlier than any of their previous pre-presidential election guidebooks, this is the 9th edition in the, quote, Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise series. In a January interview with the New York Times, Roberts said the task for the Heritage Foundation is, quote, institutionalizing Trumpism through Project 2025. Many say Heritage is actually modeling its vision of America on Orbanism. Roberts has been meeting publicly and privately for years with Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who has deep ties to Russia. Robert sings Orban's praises, especially as it relates to his embrace of Christian nationalism. Interesting that Orban has found Jesus. For decades, he identified as an agnostic liberal. The European Union, by the way, no longer even considers Hungary a functioning democracy. So the $22 million plan, which Heritage oversees and has made public, is an exhaustive 920-page America First book of policy proposals aimed at providing the next Republican president, presumably Donald Trump, with conservative rationale and recommendations on every major issue facing the country, and the apparatus and backing needed to put those policies into effect. According to Axios, Project 2025 is the most sophisticated, expensive pre-transition planning ever undertaken for either party. Well, Project 2025 is clearly written with Trump in mind, and numerous former high-ranking Trump administration officials played key roles in writing it. Heritage, as a nonprofit, cannot explicitly endorse Trump. So before dropping out, all of the leading Republican presidential candidates, and even the campaign of Robert Kennedy Jr., who's running as an independent, were briefed on these plans. At the center of the plan is increasing and consolidating presidential powers, purging the federal bureaucracy, in part by firing as many as 50,000 federal workers, and installing an army of Trump loyalists. We know what just happened to the RNC. Imagine that scenario on steroids. Project 2025 leans into what legal scholars refer to as the unitary executive doctrine, which claims that executive power is vested solely in the president, who has broad authority to act alone, rejecting the idea that the government is composed of three separate branches with overlapping powers that serve to provide checks and balances. Here's a quick rundown of just some of the goals outlined in Project 2025's policy agenda. Defund and overhaul the Department of Justice. The DOJ would no longer be independent. The White House would control the DOJ, something Trump falsely accuses the Biden administration of doing now. Dismantle the FBI and end all efforts to combat the spread of misinformation. Break up the Department of Homeland Security. Abolish the Departments of Education and Commerce. Give the president complete power over the Federal Communications Commission, which means that Trump's threats to revoke licenses of networks that criticize him would be very real indeed. Re-examine the tradition of providing workspace for the press corps and ensure the White House counsel is, quote, deeply committed to the president's agenda. Reverse the 2009 EPA finding that carbon dioxide emissions are harmful to human health, thereby preventing the federal government from regulating greenhouse gas emissions. Repeal the Marriage Equality Act. Undo LGBTQ rights and protections from, quote, every federal rule, agency, regulation, contract, grant, and piece of legislation that exists. Outlaw pornography and register educators and public librarians who purvey it as sex offenders. And pornography, by the way, could be something as simple as a book about same-sex marriage. As the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, Axios, The Hill, and many others describe it in headline after headline, Project 2025 is an all-out assault on democracy, the environment, the role of government, the LGBTQ community, education, and unionized federal workers. Its enemies list, writes opinion columnist Harold Meyerson in the American Prospect, includes scientists, woke bureaucrats, woke educators, woke diplomats, woke generals, woke G-men, and anyone who doesn't indulge the next Republican president's every whim. Paul Dans, the MIT-educated lawyer who directs the Heritage Foundation's Presidential Transition Project, puts it this way: we're systematically preparing to march into office and bring a new army, aligned, trained, and essentially weaponized conservatives ready to do battle against the deep state. According to Roberts, the Sally Yates and Colonel Alexander Vidman's so-called deep staters who prevented Trump from executing his policies in his first term are their main targets, and they must be expelled from civil service and replaced with officials ready to fulfill the president's governing agenda. The archetype of what we want to end in a bureaucrat, Dan says, is, quote, none other than Dr. Anthony Fauci. In a recent C-SPAN interview, he proclaimed, "We're not interested in placating leftist agendas in the bureaucracy. We're going to demolish them." That kind of inflammatory language and unbridled us versus them rhetoric erupts from the 920 pages of the Project 2025 handbook. Phrases such as systemic rot are used to describe a woke and corrupt federal bureaucracy that the conservative right must commandeer, reshape, do away with, gut, demolish, destroy, kill. The very first page of the Project 2025 website declares, if we are going to rescue the country from the grip of the radical left, we need both a governing agenda and the right people in place ready to carry this agenda out on day one of the next conservative administration. The plan simply calls for an executive branch that functions fully under the command of the president, and it's built on 4 pillars. Pillar 1, mandate for leadership, the conservative promise, which lays out in this book their governing agenda. Some 450 conservatives from outside of Heritage contributed to the 30-chapter plan that includes in-depth explanations and recommendations for virtually every aspect of the federal government, from the Office of the White House to the Department of Health and Human Services to the intelligence community and beyond. Pillar 2, a personnel database. Project 2025 contracted with the technology giant Oracle to build a secure personnel database that allows applicants from across the country and from all walks of life to apply online. The idea is to identify a pre-vetted pro-Trump army of up to 54,000 loyalists in legal, judicial, defense, regulatory, and domestic policy jobs. The database currently contains more than 20,000 names, and Heritage expects more than 54,000 by Inauguration Day. President Roberts says that this personnel database is a conservative LinkedIn and, quote, the most important part of Project 2025. The database is designed to find cabinet secretaries and also the low-level junior staffers and legislative assistants who will become the next generation of Republican leaders. An alumnus of the Trump White House told Axios that the online application questionnaire is designed to test an applicant's MAGA credentials with the emphasis on what applicants believe rather than on their skill or experience. Quote, they want to see that you're listening to Tucker and not pointing to the Reagan Revolution or any George W. Bush stuff, the insider said. Here are 2 sample questions. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? The president should be able to advance his or her agenda through the bureaucracy without hindrance from unelected federal officials. And do you agree or disagree with this statement? Life has a right to legal protection from conception to natural death. Pillar 3, the Presidential Administration Academy, led by Paul Dans. It's an online educational system that includes workshops, seminars, and mentorship programs designed to train loyalists and tutor future MAGA bureaucrats. Every federal employee would be required to complete the training to be part of the next Republican administration. Wow. Pillar 4, the 180-day playbook, which includes draft executive orders, how to write one, how to roll back a regulation, as well as actions to be taken in the first 180 days of the new administration. One of the draft executive orders, according to reporting by the Washington Post, is to invoke the Insurrection Act on day one of a second Trump administration. Based on conversations with the person involved with the plan, as well as internal communications that were viewed by the Post, the military would be dispatched to quell potential demonstrators protesting over new Trump policies and planned prosecutions of former Trump supporters turned critics, such as John Kelly, Bill Barr, Ty Cobb, and Mark Milley, among others. While a Heritage official denies the claim, several news sources validate it. One thing is certain. Republicans intend to hit the ground running. The plan is to take power and keep it. Project 2025 is working on what it refers to as a turnkey operation, a unified effort to take hold of the levers of power at 12 noon on January 20th, 2025. So who's behind Project 2025? Underpinning the entire Project 2025 operation is a well-financed board made up of 80 or more conservative organizations. 80 last time I looked, but I know it's more than that now. Some of the organizations are well-known and well-established. You may recognize some of them as they're listed here in alphabetical order. I'm going to tell you about two that have been around for decades, just two of the 80. The first is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It was established in 1973, so like the Heritage Foundation, is just celebrated its 50th anniversary. And coincidentally, the conservative activist who co-founded the Heritage Foundation founded ALEC. ALEC plays an immense role in what laws are introduced and ultimately passed by state houses across the country, and what legislation is never introduced. Republican lawmakers, and I say Republicans because 100% of the legislators involved in ALEC are Republicans. They meet regularly with corporate partners and other special interests to craft what it calls model legislation. These pre-packaged bills are then introduced, often word for word, by state legislators. Approximately 200 of these so-called model bills become law every year. These are laws designed to benefit corporate or conservative interests and are often written with or by big tobacco, big pharma, and other global corporations. And they're often linked to controversial social and economic issues, such as reducing environmental regulations and corporate taxes, preventing cities from introducing or increasing their minimum wage, or blocking common sense gun laws. It's interesting to note that Florida's Stand Your Ground statute is an example of an ALEC bill. Now, another prominent group behind Project 2025 is the Heartland Institute. Founded in 1984, it's a conservative think tank best known for denying both the scientific consensus on climate change and the major health risks associated with cigarette smoking. And yes, that exact billboard was erected by Heartland, although there was so much pushback that it was taken down in just a couple of days. Heartland worked with Philip Morris throughout the 1990s to discredit the science on secondhand smoke and against smoking bans. So those are just two of the well-established organizations partnering with the Project 2025. There are lots of new ones that are equally unsavory organizations that are now part of the mix, and I'm going to tell you about a few of them in just a minute. These organizations are ones that Raymond Struck of OTT calls New Right think tanks. These are groups driven to achieve the political goals of their wealthy patrons and not so much anymore policies derived from any actual research or analysis. Many of these new right think tanks are headed up, you got it, by former Trump officials. According to the New York Times and Accountable US, nearly half of the Project 2025 collaborating organizations have received dark money contributions from a network of fundraising groups linked to conservative kingpin Leonard Leo, co-chairman of the Federalist Society. Leo, of course, worked hand in glove with the Heritage Foundation in steering Trump's judicial picks. In 2022, Leo landed a controversial $1.6 billion donation, the largest in political history. It came from a 91-year-old manufacturing magnate, so there is plenty of dark money to go around. And there are plenty of billionaires providing dark money to Project 2025, the Kochs, Bob Mercer, the Bradleys, and many more. But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on just a few of the partner organizations linked to Donald Trump. First, let's take a look at the Conservative Partnership Institute, or CPI. It was founded in 2017. Mark Meadows, Trump's last chief of staff and a key figure in the effort to overturn the 2020 election, is a senior partner in CPI, whose stated purpose is the professional development of conservative staffers and elected officials. One immediate task these new right think tanks have set for themselves is to strengthen the skills of younger party loyalists, to train them to be the new party elites. According to reporting by Jonathan Swain of the New York Times and Ariba Shah of Salon, CPI has grown sixfold under Mark Meadows' leadership. The group and has become, quote, the nerve center of the MAGA movement. The group works in battleground states on changing voting rules that would advantage Republican candidates and champions the careers of young MAGA loyalists such as Marjorie Taylor Greene. Incidentally, Cleta Mitchell, who runs the euphemistically named Election Integrity Network at CPI, was on the perfect telephone call Trump had to pressure Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger into finding 11,780 votes. Now, this past March, Paul Schwartzman of the Washington Post reported that in just 1 year, CPI snatched up $41 million of real estate in Washington, D.C. 9 buildings located within blocks of the U.S. Capitol building, plus another 4 commercial properties with adjoining row houses on or adjacent to Pennsylvania Avenue. Grid News says shell companies are behind the purchases. And CPI itself refers to this string of properties as the campus it calls, guess, Patriots Row. CPI also owns a 2,200-acre compound known as a conservative Camp David near the Eastern Shore in Cambridge, Maryland, where conservatives meet for staff training and to strategize and unite. And in fact, these 80 groups meet monthly. And then informally, a lot of these group members work and meet all the time. So those 2 organizations are part of the old guard. And now I'm going to tell you about some of the conservative think tanks that were born in the Trump era, starting with this guy of America First Legal, which was established in 2021. The founder and president of America First Legal is Stephen Miller. Miller was senior advisor to Donald Trump and director of White House speechwriting, and he was the architect of Trump's first-term immigration policies, including family separation. It's worth noting that Mark Meadows and Russ Vought, someone I'll tell you about in a little bit, are board members of AFL, and CPI contributed millions of dollars to America First Legal. In fact, as I said earlier, many of the 80 organizations in the Project 2025 board, they're deeply connected. As the Washington Post put it, several of these 80 organizations were, quote, incubated by CPI. Miller describes America First as the long-awaited answer to the ACLU. AFL has successfully filed dozens of federal lawsuits to undo Biden administration policies that addressed racial disparities, supported LGBTQ rights, and expanded early voting. The Washington Post describes AFL as part of the constellation of groups led by Trump allies that represent an administration in waiting. And according to Axios, Miller is expected to land a senior role in a Trump administration, or a second Trump administration. Based on conversations with Miller, the New York Times reported that Trump's 2025 immigration plans would expand and toughen policies carried out in his first term. We're talking detention camps, large-scale arrests, mass deportations, including of those who have been in the country for years or even decades, on a scale, quote, unseen in modern American history. Mike Davis, who was chief counsel for nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee during Donald Trump's first 2 years in office, has been floated as a candidate for Attorney General in a second Trump administration. If he's Trump's second term AG, he promises, quote, a 3-week reign of terror. We're going to put kids in cages. It's going to be glorious, he said. Then there's the Center for Renewing America, started in 2021 and led by Trump appointee Russell Voigt, a Christian nationalist and former head of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. Voigt authored Chapter 2, Executive Office of the President of the United States. It's basically a how-to manual to purge the civil service. Voigt was behind Trump's controversial executive order known as Schedule F, which was signed into law in October 2020, with less than 3 months left in the Trump presidency. Schedule F called for reclassifying thousands of federal employees as political appointees, stripping them of civil service protections, and thereby making them at-will employees fireable by the president. In the final days of Trump's term, government agencies were instructed to identify and transfer employees into this new job classification. Voigt identified 88%, or 425 OMB employees for Schedule F. The fear was that Trump loyalists would sabotage Biden's administration by firing employees responsible for key government services just ahead of his inauguration. There was intense pushback from federal employee groups, and other stakeholders urged Congress to step in and block the executive order, which fortunately was never implemented. Nonetheless, Voigt told The Atlantic in September of 2023 that, quote, mere talk of Schedule F resulted in a cultural change at the department. Employees were understanding, he said, that there could be consequences for their resistance. One of the first things President Biden did when he took office was rescind Schedule F. And you won't be surprised that reimposing it is now at the top of Project 2025's to-do list. Russ Voigt and John McEntee are leading that charge. McEntee, you might remember, was Trump's former body man and personal aide, until he was fired in 2018 by John Kelly, citing security clearance concerns. McEntee apparently had a gambling problem that made him a security risk. After Kelly's departure, Trump rehired McEntee and named him White House Director for Presidential Personnel. He was in charge of rooting out and firing Trump critics. It's not enough to get the personnel right, says McEntee. What's necessary is a complete system overhaul. A complete system overhaul is exactly what Mandy Gunusakera, chief of staff in Trump's EPA, wants the next Republican administration to do to the Environmental Protection Agency. Gunusakera, who wrote Project 2025's chapter on the EPA, calls climate change, quote, a perceived threat that the left is overstating, and that the climate data she's observed she doesn't say where, suggests, quote, a mild and manageable climate change in the future. Her policy plan would gut climate research and undo every federal clean energy program aimed at curbing greenhouse gas pollution from cars, power plants, and oil and gas wells. And an EPA advisor would instead pivot to serving the needs of the fossil fuel industry. That brings us to Roger Severino. He was head of civil rights enforcement in the Department of Health and Human Services in the Trump administration, the division that's supposed to protect marginalized communities from discrimination. Instead, the social conservative and devout Catholic rolled back healthcare protections for the LGBTQ community. He has a long history of opposing gay marriage, defending conversion therapy, and objecting to transgender Americans' service in the military. In Chapter 14 of the playbook, Department of Health and Human Services, he urges the next conservative president to, quote, maintain a biblically based social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. And of course, he defines a family as comprised of a married mother and father and their children. Opposition to COVID-19 policies, he writes, galvanized conservative Christians. How much mitigation is worth the price of shutting down churches on the holiest day of the Christian calendar and far beyond, as happened in 2020, he asks. What is the proper balance of lives saved versus souls saved? Now that the Supreme Court has ended the federal right to abortion, Severino says the FDA is ethically and legally obliged to withdraw approval of mifepristone, which he calls the single greatest threat to unborn children. And he proposes that the next HHS secretary immediately reimpose regulations that required mifepristone to be dispensed in person under a doctor's supervision and be available up to 7 weeks gestation, not the 10 weeks as it currently is now. Liberal states have become sanctuaries for abortion tourism, he writes, and proposes punishing any state that refuses to share information on who gets an abortion, where, when, and why. Severino also discusses reviving the 150-year-old Comstock Act, which criminalized the circulation of, quote, obscene, lewd, and lascivious publications. Using the broadest interpretation of that act, he argues that the law could make sending or receiving abortion medication in the mail a crime, and healthcare providers, distributors, and pregnant women themselves could be arrested and prosecuted for sending or receiving them. Now, religious freedom is referenced throughout Project 2025. In chapter after chapter, faith, more specifically Christian faith, is at the center of policy recommendations, rejecting, one might argue, the constitutional separation of church and state. Page 13 of the playbook, for example, reads, when the founders spoke of pursuit of happiness, what that meant might be understood today as, in essence, pursuit of blessedness. That is, an individual must be free to live as his creator ordained. Can blessed be the fruit be that far off? And in case that's not a familiar phrase, that's how women greet each other in The Handmaid's Tale. That brings us to Jonathan Berry, who served as chief counsel on Trump's transition team and was later named assistant secretary in the U.S. Department of Labor. Berry wrote Chapter 18, Department of Labor, providing perhaps the most vivid example of this merging of policy and religion. God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest, he writes, and until very recently, the Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate by moral and legal regulation of work on that day. He then proposes that Congress encourage communal rest by amending the Fair Labor Standards Act to require that workers be paid time and a half for hours worked on the Sabbath, arguing that higher costs would reduce work on Sundays and help get Americans back to church. I mentioned earlier that recruiting and mentoring the next generation of Republicans is a top priority. Project 2025 reaches young conservatives through Turning Point USA, TPUSA. It was founded in 2012 by the young, brash MAGA star, Charlie Kirk. Turning Point's stated mission: to identify, educate, train, and organize students to promote freedom. And again, they never define the term freedom. Believed to be the fastest growing organization of campus chapters in America, Turning Point USA boasts, quote, a presence on more than 3,500 college and high school campuses nationwide. Perhaps best known for its professor watch list, which purports to expose professors who discriminate against conservative students and advance leftist propaganda in the classroom. Those named to the list routinely report being victims of intimidation, harassment, and even sexual assault and death threats. Politico says the professor watch list is riddled with errors, and Slate reports that Turning Point admits that anyone can report a staff member without evidence. The New York Times describes the site as a threat to academic freedom, and Inside Higher Ed has compared the list to a new form of McCarthyism. And yes, Penn State professors are on the list. TPUSA added a school board watch list to its portfolio in 2021. The names and photos of school board members who engage in so-called dangerous agendas are posted to the website. Dangerous agendas can include the way they teach history, race, and concepts around gender and sex. And it can also include supporting mask and/or vaccine mandates. And that brings us to Chapter 11, the Department of Education, which was written by Lindsay Burke, chief of the Heritage Foundation Center for Education Policy. Her 44-page chapter on the conservative plan for education is simple: abolish the Department of Education. And if that's not possible, reconstitute it, minus the current rules and regulations, especially as they apply to the LGBTQ community, under a new Department of Education Reorganization Act. Now, Burke argues for a future in which teachers are gagged, education is publicly funded, but education decisions are made by families. The federal government provides no oversight or accountability for how taxpayer dollars are spent beyond perhaps certifying a certain minimum level of quality among providers. These universal vouchers would be portable, no strings attached, available to all students, and private and religious schools would be free to control their admissions, i.e., reject any students deemed too difficult or too expensive to serve. So much for the longstanding principle that education is a public good and a shared responsibility. Burke also advocates for tax credit scholarships that were pushed by Betsy DeVos during her tenure as Secretary of Education. The tax credits would allow wealthy donors to fund private schools in lieu of paying taxes. Now, I just covered 5 or so of the 30 chapters in Project 2025 and a handful of the 80+ partner organizations. So that's just a small sampling of what's fueling the right and animating the plans for a second Trump presidency. So against this backdrop is a presidential candidate who last September posted this warning to Biden on his Truth Social. Republicans are already thinking about what we're going to do to Biden and the communists when it's our turn. And more recently, on Good Friday, Donald Trump posted a video of 2 MAGA pickup trucks seen in Long Island, New York. The lift gate on one of the trucks features a life-size image of a bound and hog-tied President Biden lying on the truck bed floor. Newspapers around the world reported that a former president, a candidate for re-election to that same office, was promoting his opponent as kidnapped and held prisoner. In a June speech at the Faith and Freedom Coalition conference, our former president declares, "I am your warrior. I am your justice. I am your retribution." A few minutes later, he vows in that same speech to totally obliterate the so-called deep state. In a Veterans Day speech in Claremont, New Hampshire this past November, Trump doubled down on his message of vengeance and grievance. "We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, that lie and steal and cheat on elections." He even refers to himself as, quote, "a very proud election denier." "They'll do anything," he continues, "whether legally or illegally, to destroy America and to destroy the American dream. The threat from outside forces," referring here to Russia, China, and North Korea, "is far less sinister, dangerous, and grave than the threat from within." Meanwhile, Steve Bannon, whose War Room podcast has been the media home of Project 2025, hosts a steady stream of Project 2025 partners. Here he's pictured with Jeffrey Clark, a senior fellow and director of litigation at the Center for Renewing America. In this episode, Clark says that an independent DOJ is, quote, "ridiculous, it's unconstitutional." And then, who cares about post-Watergate norms? And here, Paul Dans tells Bannon he's been a devotee of the program since 2020, and he thanks him for all he's doing for the cause. For his part, Bannon, who has been floated as the next White House chief of staff, opines in the December 5th episode of War Rooms about exacting revenge on Trump's critics, including government officials and journalists. Quote, "I want the Morning Joe producers that watch us and all the producers that watch us. This is not just rhetoric. We're absolutely dead serious. We're going to come after you." The reaction to that rhetoric shows up in the headlines like these. "Donald Trump's dictator promise is no joke," says Vanity Fair. "A Trump dictatorship is increasingly inevitable. We should stop pretending," writes the Washington Post's Robert Kagan, the neoconservative turned independent. Stephen Levitsky, a professor of government at Harvard and co-author of How Democracies Die, writes, "I'm hard-pressed to find any candidates anywhere who are so open that they would use the power of the state to go after critics and enemies." In a December town hall in Iowa, Fox News host Sean Hannity decided to take the dictator question head on. He bluntly asked Donald Trump, "They want to call you a dictator. To be clear, do you in any way have any plans whatsoever, if re-elected president, to abuse power, to break the law, to use the government to go after people?" Trump famously replied, "Except for day one." The next day on War Room, Steve Bannon called Hannity an idiot. "This is a war," he said, "and we don't have time for sunshine patriots." A few days later, the Washington Post's Philip Bump noted, "For many Americans, a turn toward authoritarianism isn't seen as a negative. The reason Trump is doing well in the polls at the moment is not simply that people are unfamiliar with his stated authoritarian intentions should he be inaugurated in January 2025. It's also that a lot of people support those intentions." Mull that over for a bit. The Heritage Foundation has published its detailed strategy online for all to read. Their mandates are campaign talking points that promise sweeping changes to our government and our lives. Unfortunately, most voters I talk to, even those I know to be politically well-informed, haven't even heard of Project 2025. Or if they've heard of it, they don't know much about it. I hope all of you will encourage the voters in your life to learn more about the Project 2025 playbook prior to game day, which of course is this November 5th. As the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and investigative journalist Maria Ressa told Politico recently, we will know whether democracy lives or dies by the end of 2024.